There is no there. You leader, we are you, man of fortune. So which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on?
Welcome everybody. We're going to give it just a few more minutes for a few more folks to pop into the webinar before we let Adam take it over. Just bear with us and enjoy a little bit more railroad music.
Well, I used to think my daddy was a black man with enough script by the company store. But now people come here to talk, and his face was said to. I was born and raised around the hazard heart. Oh, cars rolling past my door. But now they're standing, rusting more on the stand. Because we were supposed to do something. My dad was a miner, and I'm a miner's son. I'm together with the one. Cause which side are you on? Which side are you on? I said, which side are you on there? Which side are you on? Well, I had a dream that I was down south there. Just to get my payday like I done before. But when I got down to the born and raised out of the hazard heart. Oh, cars on.
Okay, I think we're about ready to get started. So thank you, Tabitha, and thank you all for joining us today. Your time is very much appreciated. My name is Adam Barrington. I'm the national organizer for the Public Rail Ownership Campaign, and we're excited to share this time with you to discuss what I believe is one of the most important and ambitious projects of our time. The case for public ownership of the rail system is relatively easy to make, given the current deplorable condition of the rail system under the private control of a handful of Class 1 robber barons. With long hours, massive understaffing, dangerous working conditions, fatigue, injuries, and deaths, the rail workers know the privately owned rail system is terrible. With derailments, declining air quality, toxins, pollution, chemical exposure, and various other hazards, the folks living in trackside communities know the privately owned rail system is terrible. And similarly, with the increase of shipments being made by truck, a far less environmentally friendly mode of transportation, those who are concerned with the well-being of the environment know the privately owned rail system is terrible. So just a couple things about the state of U.S. rail under private ownership. We've seen in recent years a 35% job loss in rail. Over the past 17 years, a 24% decline in rail carloads handled. The results of the Class 1 carriers' push for precision scheduled railroading, or PSR, that means less workers, increased workloads, longer hours, shuttered and downgraded classification yards, shops, terminals, and main lines. We've even seen between 2013 and 2022 that accident rates have increased by 28%. We know that inspectors are instructed to ignore defects, and workers face retaliation for speaking out about unsafe working conditions. And under private ownership, stock buybacks take overwhelming precedence over track maintenance, equipment, and capacity expansion. So all these problems can be traced back to a single cause, and that's the profit motive. There's no money to be made in prioritizing the safety of workers. There's no money to be made in sufficiently maintaining tracks and equipment. There's no money to be made in hiring more workers, in thorough inspections, in electrification or rail expansion. Nor is there money to be made in ensuring that what we saw happen in East Palestine does not happen again. So the pursuit of profits means that the safety and well-being of workers, trackside communities, and the environment take a backseat to stock buybacks, dividends, and the continual fattening of Class 1 shareholder pockets at the expense of the rest of us. And that's why we're calling for public ownership of the railroads. Public rail ownership means democratizing the rail industry. It means giving rail workers and the American people a voice in an industry that is far too important to remain in the hands of the Class 1 robber barons. Public ownership of the rail would also end the internationally anomalous position of the United States as a major industrial country in which the rail system is privately owned. And, for those who might think, well, maybe public rail works elsewhere, but couldn't possibly become a reality in the United States, our answer to you would be that public rail was, in fact, a reality in the United States. Notably, during World War I, the rail system was nationalized because while it was privately owned, it was ineffective, sloppy, and completely unable to meet the needs of the American people. And during that brief period of nationalization, the rail system ran more efficiently, working conditions were better, and it was such a success that a vast majority of rail workers supported permanent public ownership of the rail industry. There was a nationwide union-sponsored vote of all rail workers from all crafts and all unions, and the vote to keep the nation's railroads in public hands was overwhelmingly in favor. It was 306,720 to 1,466. So in a moment, you'll hear from Maddock Thomas, who will dive a bit deeper into the reasons that we're calling for public rail ownership. And we'll also hear from RWU General Secretary and working railroader Nick Wurst, who will give us some more insights into the everyday struggles and hardships faced by railroad workers. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A session. But before I pass the mic to Maddock, I want to briefly describe where we're at in terms of this new campaign. So I've been contacting rail workers across the country to begin the conversation about public rail ownership. And in addition to rail workers, I'm planning on increasing outreach to community organizations, environmentalist groups, and other entities that are or will be crucial allies in our struggle against the Class 1 carriers and for public ownership of the railroads. So to name a few current goals of our campaign, like I kind of mentioned, building labor, grassroots, and community support for public ownership of the railroads, building and maintaining coalitions between labor unions, environmentalist organizations, community groups, and other entities, trying to get that support from elected officials, increasing our number of official endorsements, and in terms of especially rail unions, getting the public rail ownership resolutions put forward and hopefully passed at rail union conventions, regional meetings, or wherever else those resolutions can be discussed or adopted. And that goes for other unions too, outside of the rail unions. We want to open up avenues for consistent communication between individuals and groups involved in the campaign. And some of the work I'll be doing as the national organizer is outreaching rail workers, labor unions, and other individuals and organizations through phone calls, emails, in-person conversations, however I can outreach folks. Attending conventions, regional meetings, workshops, and any other events that offer opportunities for outreach, whether that's to talk to rail workers, other members of unions, environmentalists, anybody who's interested in being involved in supporting this campaign. I'm seeking opportunities for delivering talks and presentations like this one at union meetings, again, informal gatherings, Central Labor Council delegate meetings, local union meetings, labor environment focused events, anywhere where we can get a speaking spot and talk to folks about this campaign and how important it is. And also outreaching elected officials with pro-labor or other progressive politics, and ideally with good records in terms of their advocacy and their stances on these issues. And in addition to that, increasing social media presence and also presence in print and all kinds of other media, whether that's radio, whether that's television, whether that's newspapers, magazines, anything, to get the public ownership of the railroad campaign out there and building awareness of the campaign in the general population. And so we have to turn this campaign into a movement. And that means we need the backing of organized labor, we need the backing of trackside communities, environmentalist organizations, and any and all people who will throw their weight behind this imperative struggle. So one of the things you can do right now or after the webinar is visiting publicrailnow.org. And if you're part of an organization, or if you're a member of a union, or even if you're just an individual interested in getting involved, I'd be happy to discuss the campaign with you. More than happy to give a presentation about public rail to any union or group you may belong to, discuss tactics, how you might be able to help, and get you signed on as official supporters of the public rail ownership campaign. So again, I want to thank you for your time and for being here. It's very exciting, and I hope you'll become involved in our campaign for the public ownership of the railroads. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matic.
Hi, give me a second. I will share my screen. I have a presentation. All right. I have been working with RWU for the past year, bringing forth this campaign and providing a research basis for it as part of a white paper that will hopefully be out in June. If you're not on our email list, do go ahead and subscribe to that. There's a link that I believe Oren has put in the chat that will get you there. And once this full report is published, come either mid to early June, it will have a lot more detail on some of the things that I can present on. I'm here to present very briefly today, sort of some of the more details about why public ownership. At a future time, I'll also go into some of the how and the history of public ownership of the United States, which goes way deeper than just World War II, back to the first common carriers, which were publicly owned by the states and municipalities. But for today, I'm going to start with the issue that has been on most people's minds since East Palestine last February, and that is safety. Over the past 10 years, the accident rate has risen by 28% among all railroads in the United States. This is in large part driven by the large Class 1 railroad corporations that have been most fastidious in implementing something known as precision scheduled railroading, railroading that is neither precise nor scheduled, and not what many people would consider railroading. It's relied on ever longer trains, fewer and fewer workers, more irregular schedules. As a result, we have a fatigued workforce being told not to perform inspections on cars, and fewer maintenance personnel doing maintenance on locomotives, which is leading to more accidents on the rails. Norfolk Southern has the most egregious increase in its accident rate, rising over the past 10 years by over 123%. That's more than doubling in a decade. Not something that is really comforting to those of us who live near a rail line. I'm about 500 feet from one right now, and this chart does not give me solace. Additionally, the Federal Railroad Administration last fall performed an inspection on Union Pacific's locomotive fleet, and they found that 72.7% of those have FRA defects. This has been investigated by the various railroad unions in a report they published last October that has discovered that essentially something that railroad workers have known all along, but they now have very solid evidence to confirm. The large railroads have been telling their car inspectors simply not to perform inspections and not to do maintenance on their cars because it would slow down the movement of goods. And despite this focus on speed at all costs, seemingly, and longer trains for the purpose of supposedly moving more freight, the railroads have failed to do that. The quote from the National Sand and Gravel Shippers Association was that this is the worst that it has ever been, in testimony before the Surface Transportation Board, talking about the state of service in 2022 when it was an absolute mess. largely because the railroads had laid off so many workers, they weren't able to perform all the scheduled service that they had promised. And what we see is that after every recessionary period over the past, over this century, but also a trend that was noticed as far back as the early 20th century and before, is that after the economy contracts, railroads would lay off a ton of workers. And then when the economy would start to recover, they cannot bring those people back fast enough to actually meet demand. And as a result, people shift traffic to other modes, whether that's inland waterways, trucks. Nowadays, it's predominantly trucks. And whereas carloads have tumbled 30% since 2000, we've seen a huge rise in trucking and more recently in air freight, which is unfortunate from an environmental perspective, but also for captive shippers who don't have an alternative to railroads for shipping, who are just facing worse service. They've been told and they've signed a contract with, say, CSX that is promised 5 days a week they'll have their branch line switched and they will get their cars delivered, taken away, and get new ones. And instead, CSX is coming 2 days a week whenever they feel like it. This creates huge issues for manufacturers. They can't rely on the regular delivery of goods. They're having to send people home because they don't have the materials to operate. And then when they do get switching, it's often with way more cars than their siding can fit, and they have to have a ton of their workers come on an unscheduled day, perform a bunch of overtime just to meet the needs that the railroad has foisted on them outside of their contractual obligations. The one bright spot in terms of volume for railroads has been intermodal. We've seen a 40% rise in intermodal traffic since 2000. But that has been increasingly concentrated in the largest cities. This map is just of the service cuts that took place in 2018 as a part of the implementation of PSR, Precision Scheduled Railroading, by Union Pacific and CSX. They cut an enormous amount of their intermodal lanes going from the west to the east coast. You see almost everything that originated in Salt Lake City. They cut all of those routes that used to go to Buffalo, Syracuse, Baltimore. It's nearly impossible now to ship to these destinations using intermodal freight. And as a result, you have to instead send truckers to pick up freight tens, dozens, hundreds of miles away, which is putting more vehicle miles traveled on the road and failing to shift anything to rail, which is what we should be trying to see from a climate perspective, and also just from the wear and tear that heavier and heavier trucks is doing to our highway system. This brings me to a recent development. This past week on May 9th, Norfolk Southern had its annual meeting, and they voted as part of a proxy contest between Ancora and Norfolk Southern's management. So Ancora is an active investment firm that decided that the sort of minor improvements that Norfolk Southern made as a result of the immense public pressure following East Palestine, the derailment that happened there, which you can see here in this image, which has been the most expensive derailment in U.S. history to clean up, over $1 billion so far, and the people of East Palestine are still suffering from the impact of that chemical spill. Ancora decided that despite the improvements that Alan Shaw made being relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, that this was too much, that they needed Norfolk Southern to go back to 100% PSR to get to a sub 60% operating ratio, that is spending only 60 cents out of every dollar on every dollar of operating revenue on the expenses to earn that dollar. And that has never been achieved sustainably by any railroad in U.S. history. And it's reasonably safe to consider it absolutely ludicrous. But Ancora proposed it, and long before the vote, Norfolk Southern amended its charter to redirect the compensation to their CEO to be 30% determined by the operating ratio, and they have committed themselves, even in the case that Ancora didn't win, which Ancora only won 3 seats, they lost the proxy challenge. Norfolk Southern is already committed to a sub 60% operating ratio by 2026. And as a gesture of goodwill, they cut 15% of all intermodal traffic. We saw in the chart I gave about 2018, something played out along all of the class ones. We've already seen huge service cuts to small and medium-sized cities. Even more of them are gone now because they're just not profitable enough. It's not important to these railroads to serve middle America, or even smaller towns in New England, the South, and West Coast. And so it's not happening. And this is a real push, a real reason for us to push for public ownership. It shows that we can't just rely on management being slightly better under public pressure, because other groups of investors who have an interest in these short-term profits will come along, will fight them for control of the company, and management will concede because they want to do the profitable thing anyway. And it's an excuse for them to concede back to those worst practices. As far as infrastructure investment, this is something where the Class 1s are severely lacking as well. The Association of American Railroads performed a study back in 2007 that was supposed to estimate what infrastructure do we need by 2035 in terms of trackage and maintenance facilities just to meet projected demand according to the Federal Railroad Administration, Department of Transportation. We didn't see in the study any estimate of mode shift, not attaining any higher percentage share of U.S. freight traffic to freight rail. It does not assume any increase in passenger rail service. It is just what the DOT predicts demand will be for rail. And it was estimated to be about $148 billion in 2007. And that share for the Class 1s is about $135 billion. The Class 1s claimed that they just don't have the money, that they're too poor, and they could try really hard to become more profitable to make most of that up, but that they would need $50 billion in public money to achieve the capital investment that would be necessary. And the chart on the left was the capacity as a percentage of the existing track infrastructure. In 2007, on the right is 2035 if nothing was done, which is essentially what has happened. And so we're looking at a vast overburdening of our rail system because instead of investing in capital improvements, the railroads have decided to spend all of their money on stock buybacks and dividends. This is 2022 figures, Canadian National and Union Pacific, a fairly similar story. When you put buybacks, dividends, and all of their capital investments together, capital investments make up a mere quarter. The $584 million is all that Union Pacific spent on capital improvements. We're talking about less than 100 miles of track. I believe 44 miles of track is all that they built in all of 2022. They're not spending any money on the expansion. We need hundreds of new miles of track and double tracking and triple tracking if we're going to meet that capacity needs, even just to build the sidings that will fit these extra long PSR trains. But instead, they're spending as much as they can on dividends and buybacks and as little as they can on capacity improvement, track maintenance, and equipment. Also, the same story goes for electrification. We're hearing from the AAR that they can't do it. The technology doesn't exist. But as the quote on the screen that I've pulled shows, the problem is no longer a technical but a financial one. This is not a quote that I pulled from yesterday or from Railway Age 2 months ago. This is a quote from 1918 by the man who was the Director General of the United States Railroad Administration. He ran the railroads between the end of World War I and their return to private ownership in 1920. And at the time, it was understood that electrification was the best way to run a railroad, and it remains the same today. We need to string catenary, put up wires, and run trains under those wires in the United States. It's the most energy efficient. The locomotives are about a third cheaper to purchase, a third cheaper to maintain and operate, and it's an incredible energy efficiency. But the Class 1s don't want to invest in it. They're messing around with hydrogen and batteries, which are unproven technologies, and they don't have the benefits from a cost or an operational perspective that electrification does. Meanwhile, the publicly owned Indian Railways has electrified almost 25,000 miles in the past 10 years because they committed to it, they made an infrastructure investment plan, and they did it. It's sort of a vision of what we could do if we had a publicly owned rail company in the United States. The buybacks alone from Union Pacific would cover the entire capacity investment needed for the entire rail industry in the United States for a given year. But instead, each company is just giving that back to their shareholders. Under public ownership, perhaps this could be redirected. We could have all of that money spent on infrastructure investment and also on electrification, and it can be achieved in a fairly expeditious fashion. Similarly, there's an impact from the diesel emissions that come off the locomotives that are currently in use on communities and railroad workers who live near and work in these rail yards, talking about a risk of cancer that's 10 times or more higher compared to the general population, blocked crossings from extra long trains that cause emergency vehicles to go miles around. And rail companies have very little interest in investing in cleaner technologies. The chart on the bottom shows that the percentage of the fleet of various EPA emissions tiers, higher tier being cleaner. And between 2017 and 2020, they have actually shifted to dirtier, older locomotives. Lastly, passenger service has been a big issue. The railroads, the host railroads, these Class 1 freight companies, for the most part, have caused over 1 million minutes of freight train delays a year to Amtrak for the past several years and going back to the 1970s. That's equivalent to over 657 days. They cause another 2 million hours in 2 million minutes in delays, not strictly related to freight trains, but due to their poor maintenance that causes slow zones, other signal issues. And it's vastly disproportionate compared to the impact of any other delays on Amtrak. This is despite the fact that in order to give up their obligation under their common carrier obligation to provide passenger service, they promised that they would give priority to Amtrak, but they've never followed through with it. And the Gulf Coast service, the Sunset Limited, used to run all the way to Jacksonville and down through Florida, but the route between Jacksonville and New Orleans post-Katrina, while it was repaired for freight service, CSX asked for $2.3 billion in investments before they would restore service. That is more than twice of the entire amount of money CSX spent on its whole capital plan nationwide for that year. So a truly ludicrous amount just to be able to run passenger service where they used to run multiple trains a day themselves. And under public ownership, we could address this fairly easily by just giving Amtrak the priority it deserves in dispatching and making the infrastructure improvements, double tracking that will allow for quicker bypasses of stopped freight trains and save a ton of time for the traveling public and allow for not only a mode shift to freight, but also for better passenger service that'll get people out of their cars and off the road. I will now hand it over to General Secretary of RWU, Nick Wurst, to talk a little bit about the workers' perspective for public rail.
Okay, hope everybody can hear me okay. Thanks everyone for coming and showing your interest in the work that we're doing and the work that hopefully you'll join us in doing very shortly. And thanks Adam and Maddock for kicking us off. So I won't take too much time. For us, for railroad workers who are in support of public ownership, it's fundamentally about we want a future for our jobs in our industry. Really, we want to do our jobs well. We want to do our jobs effectively, and with as minimal of obstacles in the way as possible. And the fact is, private ownership isn't getting it done, and private ownership is an obstacle at this point. So when we're talking about all of the conditions that railroad workers face, and it's different across all the crafts, between long hours, not enough time off, long-term health issues, pay that's not keeping up with inflation, and massive cuts to our jobs and to the maintenance that sort of gives us safe working conditions, and the constant drive for, on-time performance and other metrics that sort of hide and paper over the fundamental problems with the model of precision scheduled railroading. All of that's really about we want control, right? We want a say in how we railroad. We believe that our industry and the work that we do is important, and that's worth fighting for. and that it can actually provide not just good jobs for us, but also important service, not just to people in passenger service, but also, people who rely on passenger service, commuters, and all that, but also to the customers, to the shippers, to the industries and the economy as a whole that, to a certain degree does rely on freight rail still, and should have access to better freight rail service. I think it was a really shocking moment in spring of 2022 when there were government hearings about the meltdown in the freight rail network and how it could trigger crises in with the planting and harvesting season, with delays in fertilizer shipment and things like that, as well as things like necessary chemicals for water treatment and other essential goods. So what we want is we want an alternative to the corporate for-profit railroading that's dominated so far and has not only led to a decline in our standard of living, but also a decline in overall quality of service and safety for the customers and for trackside communities. So I think I'll start to wrap it up a little bit with returning to that idea of we want to do our jobs and we want there to be jobs for us in the future, and that control. Right now, all we hear about is more and more technology, how technology is going to enable them to run longer, heavier trains, how it's going to enable them to get rid of crafts in the future. We hear about the drive to simplify, cut lanes like Matic was talking about, and simplify operations, to drive talent out of the industry, in my opinion, and de-skill us is one way of looking at it. But I think it's important that when we're talking about what we want from public ownership, that we start to think about what that looks like, because I think we have, as workers, we have a very complicated relationship with federal government, with local state governments. We see plenty of publicly owned services that rail services that are privately operated or contracted out to private operators and then run like businesses and not like services. That leads to not what we want. And in reality, in my opinion, a lot of examples of basically private handouts or public money handouts to private companies. And so I don't think what we want is just to hand over our industry to the control of corporate politicians who are bought and paid for by the same investor groups that currently own railroads, right? So the idea of worker control and democracy on the railroads is part of the conversation here, and what that looks like. So, yeah, I think I'll finish it off with those final two things, or those two ideas. We want a future for ourselves and our industry, and that future doesn't just mean we want to hang on to the jobs we have now and the capacity that we have now. We want to expand that. We want more jobs, and we want to transform our industry into one that not only provides good jobs, good standards of living for us, but good service to the communities and to the customers. And we want to be able to do our jobs well, and private ownership's in the way of all that at this point. So that's it. Hopefully I'll be able to be helpful in Q&A with everybody asking questions.
All right, at this point, we can start our Q&A session. So I know we had some folks ask some questions in the chat. So Oren, if you wanted to kind of go through those, maybe that would be helpful, or people want to raise their hand as well, that works too, however we want to go about it.
Yeah, so Mark Schaefer asked first in the chat, Matic, regarding your slide map of the CSX intermodal line cuts. He notes that it's the same for intercity passenger rail. And do you include freight, local, and commuter rail transit in that map?
I mean, as far as the map, it's strictly related to intermodal containers in those lanes, Union Pacific and CSX. But as far as the campaign, I mean, we definitely are considering the impact this will have on passenger. Of course, the sort of thrust of the public rail ownership campaign is about the freight railroads, and predominantly the class ones. We're less concerned with the regional railroads or short lines than we are with these really large rail corporations and all the main lines. But as I got to the end, like the impact on intercity passenger rail is certainly important. And as Nick alluded to, the privatization and subcontracting of a lot of commuter services that's led to some deterioration in service and worse treatment of workers is certainly something that we want to make part of the conversation. I'm not sure that entirely answers your question. If it doesn't, please let me know. I can try and address it slightly differently, but that's the way I'm thinking about it.
Now, our next question in the chat came from Len Harris. Len asks, do we have ideas for a just transition from car manufacturing jobs, thinking of the United Auto Workers, and other car-centric jobs to rail? We desperately need better transit and more high-speed rail. I can just see certain industries and their workers opposing any rail initiatives if it only negatively impacts them.
Oren, can I try and tackle that to a little bit? So I think there's certainly a common cause here. One way to look at this is one of the ways that auto manufacturing in the U.S. has traditionally, and not just the U.S., but Mexico and Canada as well, has shipped cars, has been through rail, through auto rack trains. Where I work, there used to be a GM facility that was serviced by our railroad, where we had dedicated jobs that were tasked with switching out the auto racks as soon as they filled them up with the completed cars off the factory line, and then taking those cars full of cars and shipping them out in big auto rack trains. So that's declined along with a lot of other stuff. And so there's, I would love to have that GM facility back. I think there's a lot of similar examples of those places where freight rail and auto manufacturing used to be heavily connected, right? So in the immediate term, I think that needs to be part of the conversation. In terms of long term, if we're talking about providing public or improving public transportation, potentially to the point where cars become less dominant, that's a longer term, more interesting conversation that I don't necessarily have a great answer to, other than the fact that I think that there's always the means and know-how to retool production. When I was at Labor Notes recently in Chicago on a panel about public ownership, and there was a auto worker from Canada who was talking about, I think it was a Chrysler facility that was being shut down, and the community organized a fight around it to try and not only keep it open, but to retool it to producing other goods, right? So to keep the jobs in the area, to keep the jobs for the members, to keep the factory, but to start producing other things. So I think long term, that needs to be part of the discussion as well. But I think you're absolutely right that we want to make sure we make this case in a way that we aren't seen as posing it as rail jobs versus auto worker jobs, or any other at the expense of any other workers, right?
I don't know if Matic or Adam have anything to add to that. Please jump in if so. Just one more question from the chat, then feel free to raise your hands, folks, for any more questions. This comes from Amber B. Amber asks, I recall hearing from an Alan Fisher video that precision scheduled railroading, or PSR, was also a major factor in supply chain issues, which have plagued us since 2020. Can you provide any more context on that?
I can take part of that. I'm sure Nick can add his perspective as someone who's actually working during that period about what a mess that was. But a large part of that has to do with they laid off a ton of people in the early stages of the pandemic. Tens of thousands of rail workers were let go, and they just haven't been hired back. And so when we saw, as sort of happened a few months in the pandemic, rather than this massive suppression of demand that was expected, we got stimulus checks, everyone started ordering a ton of stuff. And then all of a sudden we have a huge demand to ship things. But the railroads are operating with way fewer workers than they were just weeks prior. And they're trying to run super long trains and provide as little service as they can. And those things don't work well with trying to meet that demand, and much less meeting that demand on time. Additionally, this interfaced with another issue of like the ports. The ports were super messed up. We had ships waiting offshore for like 30, 40 days just to get into the dock. And it got so profitable to ship stuff to the United States from East Asia, China particularly, because we were just buying a bunch of goods in the US, that we were shipping containers empty back to China just to ship more goods back to the US. And because railroads have pushed intermodal so hard, we now see things like grain shipped in intermodal containers, which is a little bit ludicrous. There are hopper cars that are specifically designed for grain, but railroads want to do as much as they can in intermodal because they don't like having to deal with multiple things, even if it makes more sense from a service perspective. And all of a sudden, we don't have those cars to ship to people. We don't even have the hoppers to provide to folks just because they don't have enough workers to do that switching service anymore. And so they're switching people less frequently, which is causing further backups in the manufacturing process or for the agricultural industry. And a lot of this could be addressed if we had more workers employed and we were concerned with the actual quality of service rather than just the profitability of service. But they'd rather let a lot of that service atrophy. They sort of saw it as an opportunity to get rid of some of the lower margin service that they still were providing under contracts. They're like, oh, we'll just make it as miserable as possible to use rail. We'll use the excuse of the pandemic. You'll switch to trucking. We don't have to deal with you anymore. And so that's sort of what happened, and it hasn't improved all that much is the frustrating part. But I imagine Nick can add some additional color to that as a working conductor who experienced it all.
So yeah, without trying to take up too much time, I have an interesting perspective on this because I hired onto the railroad in 2019, actually not in train and engine service, not as train crew, but as an intermodal worker. So as someone who was unloading and loading those intermodal trains that Matic was talking about, which got that big bump during the pandemic. So I started before the pandemic and I worked through the pandemic as an intermodal worker, and then started as train crew. So there's a lot that goes into all of this. And, I just want to mention at this point that we're probably not going to be able to answer everybody's questions as deeply as we would if, I had you on the phone for an hour and a half. Not that you'd necessarily want that. So it's my duty to plug the Railroad Workers United website, where we have our own material, and then we link to other people's material where we talk more in depth about precision scheduled railroading. But one of the things I just want to underline is at the root of precision scheduled railroading, and I think this is related to another question I just saw pop up in the chat of, is this intentional? Is this sabotage, right? Matic brought up that point of them trying to drive away local customers, right? And reduce everything to sort of point to point over the road trains, things like that. All of this has been driven by a hedge fund takeover, right? I'm not saying that before PSR and before railroads got really popular as places for investors to make a lot of money, that they were not operating, for profit, but it's all been, jacked up. It's all on steroids. So that idea of it can be profitable to drive away business and try and refocus on certain kind of business that they can do with less investment, with less experienced workers, with less training, with more automation, things like that. But the bottom line of precision scheduled railroading, to cut through all of the mumbo jumbo that you get from the companies, is it's about doing more with less, which I think everyone can agree sounds insane when you say it out loud, because it is, right? There are no margins for error. And that's part of the problem, is the pandemic exposed fault lines that were there already, that they had been getting away with to a certain degree. It hadn't been making it sort of out into the broader public as a problem. But when the pandemic hit, it opened all those fault lines wide open. And suddenly it became really, really obvious to a lot of people. And that, I mentioned that example of those hearings, and I think it was April of 2022, where the federal government brought representatives from the big class 1 carriers, representatives from various customer rail shipper associations, and representatives from the unions to DC to basically talk about why there was this meltdown in the freight railroad network. And if you sort of distilled it all down into a single sentence, it was, we don't have enough people to run all the trains that are needed. We're parking trains on the main line. Trains are sitting in some cases, they were sitting for days without getting recrewed because they were just out of people. Didn't have enough people. They had laid off too many people in the years prior. And so everybody agreed. The problem is we don't have enough people. The problem is the railroads haven't been able, or maybe interested in, recruiting and retaining people, offering people a job that is good enough to stay, and in the process driving away the more experienced, more long-term members of the workforce who are basically fed up with it. And so everybody agreed, we don't have enough people, and they all just kind of shrugged their shoulders, right? If we had public ownership, right? If this was a system where we were able to make decisions based on how to provide the best service instead of what makes money, then we would be able to solve this problem, right? Whether that requires massive boosts in pay, whether that requires reaching out to all of the furloughed railroad workers, laid off railroad workers who quit because the industry had become so bad, bringing them back into service, whatever it means, we would be able to explore those possibilities. Right now, all that decision-making is locked, behind all these doors to these corporate offices. And in fact, it sort of, it demonstrated where their priorities are. The previous CEO of CSX, the current CEO of CSX, by the way, comes from Ford Motor Company, on the point about common enemies between railroad workers and auto workers. the past or the previous CSX CEO used those hearings. He straight up said this. He said, if you let us run single employee or single man train crews, we won't have a staffing problem, right? So they took this opportunity of this massive meltdown that they caused to then go, well, if you let us cut the workforce even more, we'd be able to make it better, right? So they have no interest in resolving this. So yeah, I think I went on a tangent there, but hopefully that illustrates some of what people were asking about.
Thanks, Nick. And maybe on the subject of doing less for more profit, as you say, Len Harris asks, is this kind of like sabotage, almost like it was set up to be a failure in this way? I think we have nods of agreement, Len.
Yeah, I mean, this is, in my opinion, what's happening right now is there's all these investors who have gotten into railroading simply because it makes money. They have no interest in the long-term health of the industry. These are investors that came from somewhere else that used to make money and no longer does. I think what's going to happen is that at a certain point, they're not going to be able to get any more blood from the stone. The industry will be cut to the point where it crashes hard, and they're all just going to move on like vultures to strip the next industry.
And we have one more question in the chat from Maple Osterbrink. Thanks, Maple. What do any of you think is the fastest way to change the control of rail, like we're talking about?
That's a complicated question. I think it's certainly got to be several approaches. I mean, one of the main pushes right now is we're trying to build a coalition to shift the discussion around rail, to move it from, wow, we have this huge problem with the way that our rail system is structured and how our supply chains are reliant on these large duopolistic corporations, towards, well, we have a solution. We need public ownership. In the interim, there are a bunch of locally owned and publicly owned railroads in the United States. We should be leveraging those publicly owned pieces of infrastructure, like the Moffat Tunnel or the Huey Long Bridge in New Orleans, which carry like more than a third of all U.S. rail traffic, and use those choke points as sort of leverage to demand better behavior out of our rail companies. Say, if you want to use this public infrastructure, we're going to charge you more. We're also going to expect more out of you. And also, we can try and get more lines publicly owned. Like Virginia Passenger Rail Authority has been buying out rail lines that were owned by Class 1s. They were refusing to provide public service on that through passenger rail. And so now the public authority is buying out that infrastructure so that they can run passenger service. And so that's another approach. It does require giving a bunch of money to these rail corporations to basically reward them for not having done the job that they should have done, which is provide enough infrastructure that we could run passenger service. So there's a downside there, especially when 178 million acres of this country, an area larger than Texas, was given for free to railroads so that they could build rail lines basically at the cost of the public rather than through their own investment. There's an argument there partially that a lot of the infrastructure that lies, at least in the West and down in Florida for some reason, is on land grants that are it's still federal land according to the title. The title still belongs to Congress. There's just an easement for the right of way that's given to the railroads. And so if we build the public pressure and we have a strong coalition, we might be able to push to say that we're taking those easements back because they violated the public service clauses that were a part of all of those deals in the first place. But I think a large part of it is it's doing the public education and making the case for public rail ownership so that we can build that kind of coalition and build the pressure to actually make it happen. Because there's no way that we're going to go just from today to tomorrow to a publicly owned rail system without a lot of struggle in between and making that case to a lot of people and convincing folks that this is in the best interest of both our communities and all communities that are around or related to the railroads.
Yeah, I can kind of piggyback off of that as well. And so I apologize. I got booted for a second, so I might have missed some of the conversation. But yeah, in terms of how do we get there, like Maddox was saying, I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. We're going to have to build mass public support for this campaign. We're going to have to build these coalitions. We're going to have to build a movement, like I was saying earlier in the introduction. We're calling it a campaign, but this is a movement. We're going to have to get everybody together to apply that pressure that's necessary on the levers of power in order to get what we need. And so, how we get there right now, we're in our embryonic stage. So it's anyone's guess, but nothing has ever been done worth its salt without, at least in the progressive sense of history, without getting the mass of people behind it. So part of my job especially is outreach and building that mass support among workers, environmentalists, trackside communities, any and everybody who is impacted by this, and building those relationships, earning that trust, and then doing that mass organizing so that we can apply pressure in meaningful ways on the power structure. So I know that's really theoretical and kind of like, doesn't have much concrete substance to it, but at the same time, that's really where we're at. So we're sort of building the plane as we're flying, but all the same, that's how things are done. That's how it's always been done. So I think Nick wants to add to this, so I'll defer to him.
Oh no, don't defer to me. Yeah, I just want to second everything Maddox and Adam's saying. I think there's no shortcuts to this, right? I think there's any number of get rich quick schemes people could try of manipulating this legal loophole, that long forgotten law somewhere or agreement with some long defunct railroad corporation or things like that. And all of those are tools we can try and use, but I think it comes down to building power. And I think a special role has to be played here by organized labor. Obviously, as railroad workers that support public ownership, we need to be making this case to our coworkers. But we also need to be making this case to other unions and building up worker pressure in terms of, if we're going to win something that works for workers, we got to be in control of it. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of us are very complicated feelings about the current administration, past administration, for good reason. So we really can only trust ourselves. And so just on that, because I saw this question pop up and I do want to take a shot at it. Why not regulation, right? And then ownership? Sure, I'm all for regulation. I'm all for let's trying to regulate things. Hasn't been working so far. I don't think there's any evidence that it's going to work. The bottom line is the private ownership of railroads generates massive amounts of money for the companies that own them that they then spend on buying politicians and lobbying against regulations. I mean, we still don't have a comprehensive rail safety bill after East Palestine. And the private ownership of railroads is playing a role in preventing that from happening. The FRA promulgated a new rule for two-person crews. But as we're really fond of saying, there's loopholes in it that you can run a freight train through. It leaves wide open the ability for rail companies to petition the FRA, which is run by appointees, not elected, for exemptions to allow them to run single person crew operations, right? So it's entirely dependent on who's staffing the FRA and how much of a backbone they have and how much money is getting dumped into their pockets by the rail governments. I think this is a big problem. The idea that we can regulate our way out of this. The unions have been throwing money at politicians for a long time to try to regulate this stuff. Passenger associations have been throwing money at politicians for a long time to get regulations. Even other companies, right? Companies that depend on railroads have been trying to lobby, and they have deep pockets and they still haven't gotten what they want, right? So I think it's time to say, yeah, let's fight for any meaningful regulations that we think we can win. But it's clear that we're going to have to do more, and that ultimately the way to protect anything that we do win in the form of regulation is going to be public ownership and public control, to basically set that in concrete.
I have a quick one. That's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Maple.
Okay. Yeah, quick one. Well, you know, Thomas is our comrade on the call right now. There's that what we're talking about right now, right? The incremental versus you know, ownership of the tracks. And Maddock had that point about and Solutionary Rail too, the common carrier obligation. They don't own the land, but you know, some folks like Thomas, like, oh yeah, you have to purchase the land. He said Congress, and there's not enough money. It would be billions of dollars. So what do you guys say about that now that you're kind of in the room together? Because I always like that common carrier obligation. They're not doing what they're supposed to do, and they don't own the land. And not that that's a side quick way, but I think it's part of it. And you know, right now we can have all these Ohio's people are not only injured, they're killed, you know, every week. And, you know, I see the reports, and, you know, this is a serious, this is so serious right now. It seems to be the best time to really go for the whole enchilada. Anyway, what do you guys think about that? You know, open access and partial, and the common carrier obligation, and who owns the tracks? I'd really like to hear you before we sign them.
I guess that was somewhat directed to me. I will just say that that is very much not a short question. I unfortunately think I don't have time to fully answer that here. The common carrier obligation, of course, would be nice as a thing to bring back. There is an argument that it makes rail service commercially non-viable in the United States, and rate regulation would lead to a lot of bankruptcies. Which is hard because you've got to balance that obligation with, as long as they're privately owned, they have to be profitable, at least like to a minimum level, that they don't go bankrupt. Oh, sorry, my camera's off. But unfortunately, sort of that's the state we're living in. If we get re-regulation, I think the railroads would fight that as hard, if not harder than just privatization. Because it would lead to enormous change, and it would require basically repealing the Staggers Act from 1980 and going back to the ICC. Not that there's not an argument for doing that, but I think that if we're going to fight for that, we might as well fight for public ownership. But that's a much larger conversation for another webinar. And I'm sure we'll have many more. I think we're having monthly events now, and my paper will be launched next month, which will talk a little bit about that. So love to get to that question, but just don't have time to fully get into it now. So I will hand it back to Adam, I think, to wrap us up.
Sure. So again, want to thank everybody for being here today. Appreciate your time. And yeah, so if you're interested in getting involved, you should visit publicrailnow.org. I think my contact information was on the screen for a second, but you can, there you go. Yep, you can contact me, publicrailorganizer@gmail.com. My cell is 330-635-9478. Call or text anytime. definitely looking to start some conversations, get to know some folks. And as the national organizer, I am willing to go anywhere, talk to anybody, and just get the ball rolling on this thing wherever and with whoever I can. So again, I want to thank everybody for participating, and make sure you reach out, visit the website, get in touch with me, and I hope to talk with you soon. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.